Right now, in this exact moment, something inside you is already deciding how you feel about what you are about to hear. Not you, not your conscious mind. Something older, something faster, something that has been making decisions on your behalf for years without asking your permission. That is not a metaphor. That is the architecture of an untrained mind. And if you have ever said something you immediately regretted, avoided something you knew you needed to do, felt your emotions take the wheel while your rational mind watched helplessly from the passenger seat, then you already know exactly what that architecture costs you. The question is not whether your mind is doing this. It is. The real question is whether you are going to keep letting it. Most people spend their entire lives answering that question with silence. They drift from mood to mood, from reaction to reaction, building a life shaped not by deliberate choice, but by whatever emotion happened to be loudest in that moment. A comment ruins their entire afternoon. A delay triggers disproportionate anger. A single uncomfortable feeling becomes a decision they will spend years undoing. And the most painful part is that they were never taught any differently. They were never given the tools. They were never shown the gap. That gap, the space between what you feel and what you do, is where everything changes. And that is precisely what this audiobook is here to build. Welcome to Elite Success Audiobooks. What you are about to experience over the next several hours is not motivation. Motivation fades. This is not inspiration. Inspiration is temporary. This is mental training. Real, structured, practical training designed to rewire the relationship between your emotions and your behavior at a fundamental level. Not by suppressing what you feel, not by becoming cold or numb or disconnected from the full experience of being human. Emotions are not your enemy. Let that be clear from the very first moment. The problem has never been that you feel things deeply. The problem begins the instant feelings are allowed to lead. When emotions give the orders and your mind obeys without evaluation, that is where discipline collapses. That is where relationships suffer. That is where progress stalls quietly in the background, while you wonder why your potential and your reality never seem to match. The truth is simple, and it is rarely practiced. Your emotions are signals. Your mind is the instrument, and you are meant to be the one in command. When the mind is untrained, emotions seize control by default, not because they are more intelligent than you, not because they are more qualified, but simply because nothing else is present to lead. When the mind is trained, emotions still speak. They still arise. They still carry information, but they no longer command. You feel them. You acknowledge them. And then, with clarity instead of impulse, you choose your response. Most people were never taught how to do this. They were shown how to express feelings, how to vent, how to seek comfort when discomfort arrives. They were not shown how to pause. They were never taught to sit with pressure without flinching. They were never given practice in commanding their inner world when everything around them begins to shake. So when stress appears, they collapse inward. When temptation arrives, they surrender. When life pushes back, emotions take the wheel, and the destination changes without their consent. This audiobook exists to reverse that conditioning, not through hype, not through empty declarations, through training, precise mental training that teaches you how to separate feeling from action, how to create space between impulse and behavior, and how to build the kind of inner authority that does not fracture under pressure. Over the hours ahead, you will learn why willpower alone is an unreliable foundation. You will learn why discipline consistently outperforms motivation. You will understand why calm is not something you are born with, but something you construct layer by layer through deliberate practice. You will learn how to engage with hard things even when every part of you is urging retreat. You will learn how to stay grounded and centered when emotions are pulling hard in every direction. Each section of this audiobook is designed as a mental exercise, not theory for its own sake, not philosophy meant for passive entertainment. Practical training you can begin applying immediately in the real moments of your life. Conversations that trigger you, decisions you keep delaying, pressure that has a way of making you become someone you do not recognize. This is where training matters most. By the time you finish listening, you will not be emotionless. You will be grounded. You will not be passive. You will be deliberate. You will no longer feel ambushed by your own reactions, because you will have learned how to lead yourself from the inside out. As you listen, resist the urge to rush. Treat this as the training it is. The goal is not a moment of inspiration. The goal is a mind that responds to your direction. If you are prepared to stop being governed by moods, urges, and emotional swings, stay with this and begin the work of becoming the one who decides, especially when emotions are pushing hardest. You were never weak. You were never lacking in intelligence or capacity or raw potential. What you were missing was training. From early on, you were conditioned how to react, how to express what you feel, how to seek relief when circumstances became uncomfortable. But almost no one taught you how to lead your own mind. So when pressure arrives, emotions surge forward by default, not because they are more capable, not because they belong in charge, but because there is a vacuum of leadership, and something always fills a vacuum. An untrained mind does not select its actions. It reacts to whatever force feels strongest in the moment. It moves automatically toward comfort and away from discomfort. It avoids effort, resists the unknown, and pursues relief as quickly as it can find it. This is not a character flaw. It is a survival pattern. And while survival patterns are essential in moments of genuine danger, they quietly destroy long-term growth when they are running your daily life without supervision. You see this pattern in operation everywhere. You make the decision to remain calm, and anger escapes before rational thought can intervene. You plan to work, and distraction seduces you away from the task. You commit to consistency, motivation dissolves, and you stop. You know what you need to do, and you choose the opposite. Over time, this pattern creates something far more corrosive than a single mistake. It creates distrust in yourself. When your actions continuously contradict your intentions, you stop trusting your own commitments. You stop believing your own voice. This is the hidden tax of an untrained mind. Most people assume that control should feel effortless. They believe disciplined individuals were simply constructed differently, that calm people navigate easier circumstances. That focused people experience less resistance. None of these assumptions are accurate. Control is not a temperament. Calm is not a gift that arrives at birth. These are trained capacities, skills built through deliberate repetition. Without that training, the mind defaults to emotion-led behavior. With training, the mind learns to pause, evaluate, and respond rather than simply reacting without reflection. Your brain is engineered to prioritize survival above purpose. It continuously scans for threat, amplifies discomfort, and drives quick action to reduce tension. Stress communicates urgency. Get out of this now. Anxiety broadcasts alarm. Avoid this before it damages you. Anger delivers commands. Defend yourself without delay. Comfort whispers seductively, stay exactly where it feels safe. None of these voices pause to consider whether their guidance aligns with the future you are genuinely building. They are concerned only with short-term relief. And when relief becomes the primary goal, growth stops completely. The mind you operate with today was sculpted by repetition, not by conscious design. Every time you reacted without pausing, you reinforced that neural pathway. Every time you avoided something demanding, you taught your mind that avoidance is a successful strategy. Every time you followed a feeling without questioning its authority, you gave that feeling more power over future decisions. Over years, these repetitions became automatic. Automatic behavior feels like personality, like who you fundamentally are, even when it is simply what you practiced most consistently. Leadership begins the moment you recognize this. Not with self-criticism, not with shame, with clarity. Your mind is not designed to dominate you. It is designed to serve you. But service requires structure. Without clear standards and consistent direction, the mind runs without constraint. It leaps from thought to thought. It reacts to every emotional signal. It feels perpetually busy, yet generates little real progress. It feels intensely active, yet lacks purposeful direction. Training your mind begins with awareness, not with forcing transformation, not with suppressing emotion, but with awareness. You begin to observe when you are reacting instead of choosing. You notice how swiftly emotions push toward action. You recognize the physical signals, the tightening in your chest, the shallow quality of your breath, the urgent impulse to escape or confront. These moments are not evidence of failure. They are data points showing you precisely where training is required. An untrained mind accepts every thought it generates as truth. It treats emotions as mandatory directives. It confuses intensity with accuracy. Training introduces separation. You learn to perceive thoughts as events rather than orders. Emotions become information rather than instructions. You become the one who determines what happens next. This separation creates space, and space is where genuine control lives. At first, this process feels foreign and uncomfortable. That discomfort is meaningful. The mind resists surrendering its authority. When you pause instead of reacting, the mind objects loudly. It insists on urgency. It demands that you resolve the feeling immediately. It pulls toward familiar patterns with considerable force. This resistance is not a sign that training is failing. It is evidence that training has genuinely begun. No established system relinquishes control without protest. Leadership does not require silencing emotion or performing indifference. It means assigning emotion its accurate role in the hierarchy. Emotions are messengers. They alert you to values that feel violated, boundaries that feel crossed, needs that are going unmet. But messengers do not issue the final orders. When emotions lead, life becomes reactive and disorganized. When awareness leads, emotions transform into valuable data rather than destructive forces. This is precisely why so many people feel trapped by themselves rather than by their circumstances. They are not trapped by what is happening around them. They are trapped by automatic reactions they never learned to interrupt. They wait for motivation. They wait for the right emotional conditions. They wait to feel prepared. And while they wait, life continues moving without them. Training teaches something fundamentally different. You act first. You decide first. Emotions follow the decision rather than preceding it. As you move forward through this audiobook, understand this with clarity. You are not attempting to become a different person. You are stepping into a role you were never shown how to occupy. The role of inner leader. The one who can experience emotion fully without surrendering to it. The one who can feel deeply without being driven by what is felt. The one who consistently chooses long-term direction over the seductive pull of short-term comfort. Many people who begin this kind of mental training report something unexpected. Around the number 777, representing spiritual alignment, inner wisdom, and the convergence of thought, word, and action, they experience a threshold moment, a point where the training stops feeling like discipline imposed from outside and begins feeling like alignment discovered from within. If these principles are already beginning to create that kind of shift in the way you think and choose, drop 777 in the comments right now. Let this community witness the moment awareness began to outpace reaction. The foundation has been laid. Everything that follows builds directly upon it. You were never taught to lead your mind, but training is entirely possible. And once it begins with real consistency, control stops feeling like constant effort. It starts feeling like alignment. And that is precisely where genuine self-mastery begins. Emotions are not orders. This is one of the most important distinctions you will ever internalize, and yet it is one that most people spend their entire lives never making. They live as if emotions are directives that must be obeyed instantly. When anger emerges, they speak. When fear surfaces, they retreat. When boredom arrives, they escape. This happens so automatically, so seamlessly, that it feels entirely justified. The emotion feels urgent. It feels convincing. It carries enormous weight. But urgency does not equal truth, and intensity does not grant authority. A signal exists to inform, not to make decisions. Physical pain signals potential injury. Hunger signals nutritional need. Fear signals possible danger. These signals are genuinely valuable. They help you understand what is occurring internally and externally. But nowhere in their functional design Are they intended to dictate your actions without evaluation? That confusion emerges when the mind has not been trained to interpret before responding. When an emotion arises, it generates a physical sensation in the body and a story in the mind simultaneously. The body tightens, heats, accelerates. The mind adds meaning, assumptions, narrative, and conclusion. Together, they manufacture pressure. That pressure pushes for immediate release. Speak now, escape now, quit now, react now. Without trained awareness, the reaction feels inevitable. But inevitability is an illusion constructed by years of unchallenged habit. Consider anger. Anger frequently signals that a boundary feels crossed or that something genuinely important feels threatened. That information carries real value, but anger itself does not understand the best method of response. It does not calculate consequences. It does not think across time. If anger were always obeyed, every meaningful relationship would eventually collapse. The signal has validity. The command that accompanies it is unreliable. The same principle applies to fear. Fear signals uncertainty and the possibility of risk. Useful data. But fear is specifically designed to exaggerate threat rather than measure it with accuracy. If fear were always obeyed, growth would stop permanently. Opportunities would be bypassed without examination. Important conversations would be perpetually avoided. Potential would remain dormant. Again, the signal serves a purpose. The instruction it carries is not trustworthy. Training your mind begins with separating these two distinct functions. You learn to receive the signal without surrendering decision-making authority. You experience the emotion fully, but you introduce delay before action. That delay is transformative. It creates a gap between feeling and behavior. In that gap, genuine choice becomes available for the first time. Most people never experience this gap. They believe that feeling and doing are inseparable, that experiencing an emotion obligates immediate action. This belief feels natural only because it has been practiced so consistently for so long. It is not truth. It is conditioning. When you begin to pause, the mind protests. It warns that waiting is dangerous. It insists that if you do not act immediately, consequences will follow. This is the emotional system defending its position of authority. It depends on immediacy. Slowing down threatens its control entirely. Training looks like this in practice. An emotion surfaces. You acknowledge its presence without judgment. You name it with precision. This is anger. This is anxiety. This is frustration. Naming the emotion does not diminish it, but it prevents fusion. You are no longer submerged inside the emotion. You are observing it from a slight distance. That shift alone reduces its authority significantly. Next, you remind yourself of a foundational truth. Feeling something does not obligate acting on it. This statement sounds obvious when written plainly, yet it is almost never practiced consistently. You can feel anxious and still speak with clarity. You can feel angry and still choose silence. You can feel discomfort and still execute the demanding task. The emotion does not dissolve, but it loses its function as commander. Real control means allowing emotions to exist fully without granting them decision-making power. You stop negotiating with feelings. You stop waiting for them to transform before you move. You act based on established values rather than fluctuating moods. Over time, this rewires the relationship between emotion and behavior at a deep structural level. The mind learns that emotions are not emergencies requiring immediate response. They are experiences. They rise, reach a peak, and subside when left alone, without reactive fuel. This chapter establishes the foundation. Signals inform. Leaders decide. When you consistently separate these two functions, calm becomes available even in genuinely difficult situations. There is another layer to this process that most people overlook entirely. The emotional system does not just produce feelings, it produces stories. Stories that feel accurate because they feel vivid. Stories that feel true because they feel urgent. When anger is present, the story says, "This person disrespects you, and that disrespect requires a response right now." When anxiety is present, the story says, "This situation is more dangerous than it appears, and you should withdraw before something goes wrong." When frustration builds, the story says, "Nothing is working. Effort is pointless. You should stop trying and find relief somewhere easier." These stories arrive fully formed. They carry emotional weight. They reference past experiences. They predict future outcomes. And they do all of this in fractions of a second, before your reflective mind has any chance to evaluate their accuracy. The untrained mind accepts these stories as reality. It does not question the narrator. It does not examine the evidence. It simply receives the story and begins acting as though every detail is factual. This is why people say things they never intended to say. This is why people make commitments they never intend to keep. This is why intelligent, capable individuals repeatedly act against their own values and then struggle to explain why afterward. The story took over. The emotion authored the decision, and the rational mind arrived too late to do anything but observe the damage. Training introduces a new relationship with these stories. You learn to recognize a story as a story, a construction of the mind rather than an accurate report of reality. You begin to ask different questions. Is this story complete? Is this interpretation the only possible one? What would this situation look like if I removed the emotional charge from my analysis? These questions do not eliminate emotion. They do not diminish the feeling. They simply slow the process enough to allow evaluation before action. They restore you to the position of narrator rather than the character being narrated. There is a physical dimension to this training that deserves direct attention. Emotions do not exist only in the mind. They live in the body first, a tightness that develops across the shoulders before you consciously register that you are stressed, a heaviness in the chest that arrives before you have articulated that you are discouraged, a restless, electric tension in the limbs before you have named what you are feeling as anxiety. The body is an early warning system. It signals emotional activation before the mind has assembled the full story. When you develop sensitivity to these physical signals, you gain earlier access to the pause. You catch the emotion before it is fully converted into narrative, before the story has been completed, before the momentum toward action has fully built. This is a significant tactical advantage in the work of self-command. The breath is the most immediate and accessible bridge between physical sensation and mental response. A single, slow, deliberate exhale, not as a relaxation technique, but as a recalibration signal, tells the nervous system that immediate action is not required. It creates a biological interruption in the momentum from feeling toward behavior. The mind does not have to figure out what to do next. It simply needs a moment. A single breath can provide that moment, and in that moment, the entire trajectory of what happens next can shift. Consider how different your last significant emotional reaction might have looked if you had inserted 3 seconds of deliberate breath before your first response. Not 3 minutes, not a long meditation, 3 seconds. The outcome of countless conversations, decisions, and relationships has turned on intervals smaller than that. This is not an exaggeration. This is the mechanics of self-command made visible. The difference between someone who is constantly overwhelmed by their emotional experience and someone who moves through the same emotional landscape with steadiness and direction is not that the second person feels less. Research consistently demonstrates that emotionally intelligent, self-directed individuals often feel things with considerable intensity. The difference is not the volume of the emotion. The difference is what happens between the feeling and the response. That space, that trained interval, is what you are building through every section of this audiobook. Every principle that follows is building in that direction, and the first 2 layers of that foundation are now in place. Your mind was never trained to lead. That is not a limitation. It is a starting point. And emotions are signals, not commands. That is not a philosophical position. It is a functional truth that when practiced consistently, changes the entire quality of your internal experience. The path forward is not about perfection. It is not about never reacting impulsively again. It is about building a pattern, a deeply ingrained, reliably available pattern of catching yourself sooner, pausing longer, and choosing with greater deliberateness each time. That pattern compounds. It builds on itself with each repetition, and it is already beginning to form right now in the way you are listening, in the quality of attention you are bringing to this material. The training has started. It started the moment you decided to stay. Feel everything, obey nothing automatically. Let emotions speak their information. Let your trained mind determine the response. This is the core of self-command. Everything changes in the pause. Not the extended pause you experience during a vacation or a moment of deliberate rest, but the brief, almost imperceptible pause between feeling something and acting on it. This is where control is either claimed or permanently surrendered. Most people never experience this pause. Their emotions move directly into behavior with no interruption whatsoever. Feeling becomes action without any gap. And when that happens, choice disappears entirely. What remains is not decision-making. What remains is pure reaction, faster than thought, older than awareness, and completely outside deliberate control. The pause is not natural. It is not something the untrained mind produces on its own. It is trained. It is constructed through deliberate repetition across many different situations, many different emotional intensities, many different levels of pressure. When an emotion rises, it generates momentum. The body tightens. The breath becomes shallow. The mind narrows its focus to the immediate source of the feeling and blocks out broader context. This momentum pushes powerfully toward immediate release. Speak now. Escape now. Defend yourself now. React now. That urgency feels absolutely real. It can feel dangerous in its intensity. But urgency is most often simply discomfort demanding relief. It is not an accurate signal about what the situation actually requires. If you act within that urgency, you reinforce the neural belief that emotions must be obeyed quickly. If you pause, even briefly, even imperfectly, you interrupt that belief and begin constructing something new in its place. Most people carry an unexamined assumption that pausing represents hesitation or weakness. This assumption is precisely backward. Pausing is strength. It is the moment you disengage autopilot. It is the moment you shift from reaction to response, from being driven by emotional momentum to operating from deliberate choice. Without a pause, there is no leadership. There is only impulse acting in the costume of decision. The pause does not require a significant interval of time. It can be 3 seconds, 5 seconds, a single slow breath completed with awareness. What matters is the interruption itself. That interruption communicates to the mind that action is not yet authorized. It signals a transfer of authority. The emotion is still fully present, but it no longer controls the timing of what happens next. This is extraordinarily difficult at first because emotions are specifically designed to resist being delayed. They demand immediacy. They are built to accelerate behavior, not to wait for evaluation. When you introduce the pause, the mind may experience something that feels like panic. It may tell you that waiting will make everything worse. That silence will cost you something important. That failing to act immediately is itself a form of dangerous passivity. This is the survival system asserting its authority and testing whether its old strategies still govern outcomes. The survival system equates speed with safety. In physical emergencies, that equation has real validity. But in the emotional landscape of modern life, in conversations, decisions, relationships, professional challenges, personal commitments, speed is frequently the mechanism that creates damage rather than preventing it. Building the pause begins with physical awareness. Emotions arrive in the body before they fully form as stories in the mind. The tightened shoulders, the clenched jaw, the accelerated heartbeat, the shallow, constricted breath. These physical signals appear earlier than the conscious emotional narrative. When you learn to notice them, you are catching the emotion before it has fully converted into behavior-driving momentum. You are gaining access to the pause at its earliest available point, which is also where the pause is most effective. The simplest and most reliable method for building the pause is through breath, not as a relaxation strategy or a stress reduction tool, as a control mechanism. 1 deliberate inhale, 1 controlled exhale. That single cycle creates a biological break in the momentum from feeling toward action. It provides the nervous system a moment to recalibrate. It creates space for the mind to step back into its proper leadership position. During the pause, you ask a single question, not a complicated philosophical inquiry, not a lengthy internal debate, a practical, immediate question. What action aligns with the person I intend to be in this situation? This question redirects attention away from the intensity of the feeling and toward the standards you have established for yourself. It reminds you of something the emotional system consistently ignores, that emotions are temporary, but actions carry consequences across time. At first, you may still choose poorly even with the pause in place. This is an expected part of the training process. The pause does not guarantee an optimal outcome. It creates the opportunity for a better outcome, and the quality of that opportunity improves with every repetition. Each time you pause, even when the result is still imperfect, you strengthen the habit of interruption. Over time, interruption becomes increasingly automatic. Reaction slows, the window of choice expands, options that were previously invisible become visible. Without the pause, emotions compress time. Everything feels simultaneous and urgent. Everything demands immediate attention. Everything seems to require a response right now, or the moment will be lost. With the pause, time stretches. You begin to see outcomes you could not see while inside the emotional momentum. You see yourself and the situation from a measured distance. That distance is not detachment from what matters. It is perspective on what actually matters and how to address it with intention. This is why people with strong self-command appear so capable under pressure. They are not suppressing emotion. They are not indifferent to what is happening. They are pausing inside the emotion, giving themselves the space to choose their words carefully, to delay commitments until clarity returns, to prevent conflict that would cost far more than any momentary relief would provide. Others consistently interpret this quality as confidence or natural authority. What it actually represents is trained restraint, built deliberately over time through countless small opportunities to practice interruption. The pause also provides significant protection against regret. Most regret does not emerge from carefully considered decisions. It emerges from reactions executed under emotional pressure, words delivered in anger, messages transmitted in frustration, choices made purely to escape the discomfort of the moment. When you build the pause as a consistent practice, you substantially reduce the number of significant decisions made under that kind of emotional pressure. That single shift, compounded across a lifetime, changes the entire trajectory of what you build, what you protect, and who you become in the process. There will be moments when maintaining the pause feels genuinely unbearable. Moments when the emotion feels too powerful to hold. Moments when the urgency to act feels like a physical force pushing you forward. These are precisely the moments that carry the most training value. If you can pause in those moments, even briefly, even imperfectly, you are strengthening the deepest and most critical layer of self-control. You are demonstrating to yourself, with your own behavior, that feelings do not hold final authority over your actions. Pausing does not mean inaction. It does not mean permanent delay. It means choosing the timing of your response deliberately, rather than surrendering that choice to emotional momentum. Sometimes the pause reveals that speaking is the right choice. Sometimes it reveals that walking away serves everyone better. Sometimes it reveals that waiting without response is the most powerful option available. The pause does not prescribe the action. It restores your capacity to choose the action. As this practice deepens, something significant begins to emerge. Emotions begin to lose their sense of urgency, not because they diminish in intensity, but because they have learned that urgency alone no longer determines outcomes. The emotional system is adaptive. When it discovers that rushing no longer works as a strategy, it gradually stops rushing. The mind learns that it will not be hijacked into action by intensity alone. This learning takes time. It requires repetitions across different types of emotions and different levels of pressure. But the learning occurs, and when it does, the quality of your decision-making shifts at a level that others around you will notice before you fully recognize it yourself. There is a number that carries particular resonance in quantum consciousness research, the number 11. In the study of vibrational states and conscious awareness, 11 represents the threshold moment, the point where one way of operating ends and a fundamentally different one becomes available. The pause is that threshold in practice, the moment between feeling and behavior where the old pattern ends and the new one becomes possible. If the pause is already changing how you experience pressure and emotional activation, if you can feel this threshold beginning to open, drop the number 11 in the comments. Let this be the marker of the moment you found the gap between feeling and choice. The pause is where your power lives. Protect it. Practice it across every available opportunity, regardless of how small the emotion or how low the stakes seem. Because the capacity you build in low-pressure moments is the capacity you draw on when the pressure becomes genuine. Build the pause with patience. Trust the repetitions. In that small, trained space between impulse and behavior, your authority over your own life is constructed, one moment at a time. Now consider what actually drives sustained behavior in your life. Not what you say you are committed to, not what you intend on Sunday evening when the week ahead feels full of possibility. What actually drives behavior when conditions are imperfect, when resistance is present, when the feeling that got you started has long since faded? The honest answer for most people is motivation. And that is precisely where the instability lives. Motivation feels extraordinary when it arrives. It generates energy, optimism, and a sense of possibility that makes everything seem achievable. In those moments, commitment feels effortless. You are ready. You are energized. You are certain this time will be different. But motivation is not a reliable foundation. It is an emotional state. And like all emotional states, it is temporary. It responds to energy levels, circumstances, feedback received, and the quality of sleep from the night before. Motivation appears without warning and disappears with equal unpredictability. Discipline, by contrast, rarely feels exciting. It does not deliver a rush. It does not create the vivid sense of possibility that motivation provides. Yet discipline is what actually determines behavior across time. Not in the moments when everything feels aligned and effort feels easy. In the ordinary moments, the difficult moments, the moments when no part of you wants to continue. Most people organize their behavior around motivation. They wait until they feel ready. They wait until the emotional conditions support the action. When motivation is present, they engage with intensity. When it recedes, they stop. This creates an unmistakable pattern: enthusiasm followed by inactivity, followed by renewed motivation, followed by the same collapse. Progress becomes hostage to emotional state rather than anchored in deliberate intention. Motivation is emotional by nature. It rises and falls with internal and external conditions. The problem is not that motivation is temporary. The problem is allowing it to function as the primary driver. When motivation leads, your emotional state decides when action occurs. This means the mind is still obeying feelings rather than following direction. Discipline operates through an entirely different mechanism. Discipline is not a feeling. It is a commitment made in advance and honored regardless of what internal conditions are present when the commitment comes due. Discipline does not inquire about your current emotional state. It does not ask whether you feel ready or motivated or inspired. It asks only what you already decided matters, and it acts from that decision. That distinction sounds simple when stated directly, but the practical difference it creates is enormous. It moves the locus of authority from fluctuating emotion to deliberate intention. Every time discipline leads behavior, the mind learns that feelings do not hold final authority over action. An untrained mind resists discipline with considerable energy because discipline eliminates the negotiation that the mind depends on. The untrained mind prefers to revisit every decision repeatedly. Maybe later. Not today. Just this once. These internal arguments feel like reasonable flexibility. They sound like self-compassion, but they are emotional delays presenting themselves as rational consideration. And every time you accept them, you teach the mind that resistance is a viable strategy. Discipline ends that conversation. When you act without waiting for motivation, you transmit a clear and consistent message. Feelings do not determine timing. At first, the mind pushes back forcefully. It escalates discomfort. It amplifies fatigue. It generates excuses that sound increasingly persuasive. This is not evidence of failure. This is the mind testing whether the previous rules still apply. It is checking whether discomfort retains its authority over behavior. Most people interpret this resistance as a sign that something has gone wrong. They conclude that the resistance means the action is too difficult or the timing is wrong. In reality, the resistance means discipline is directly challenging emotional authority, which is exactly what it is designed to do. If you continue despite the resistance, the mind begins to adapt. It learns that objections no longer change outcomes. Over time, the resistance loses its force because it loses its function. Discipline is frequently misunderstood as harshness or self-punishment. This misunderstanding actively prevents people from practicing it consistently. Real discipline is not aggressive. It does not demand emotional suppression or the performance of enthusiasm you do not feel. Real discipline is calm and firm. It acknowledges discomfort without obeying it. You can feel fatigued and still act. You can feel bored and still continue. You can feel strong resistance and still execute what you committed to. Discipline requires no emotional agreement from the parts of you that would prefer comfort. This is precisely why discipline builds authority over time. Authority comes from consistent follow-through, not from the force of individual moments. When your mind observes you consistently completing what you committed to, regardless of emotional conditions, it adapts its relationship to those commitments. It stops escalating emotion as a means of influencing behavior. It becomes more cooperative, more settled, because the old strategy of emotional escalation has been proven ineffective. Motivation creates peaks. Discipline creates a reliable baseline. Peaks feel extraordinary, but your baseline determines the actual quality and direction of your life. What you do occasionally defines memorable moments. What you do repeatedly defines who you are. Discipline raises your baseline consistently over time. It makes disciplined action normal rather than heroic, expected rather than exceptional. This shift in relationship to action is one of the most significant changes that sustained discipline produces. Discipline also substantially reduces decision fatigue, one of the most underappreciated drains on mental energy and self-control. When significant actions are decided in advance and locked in as non-negotiable commitments, you preserve enormous mental and emotional resources. You are no longer engaging in a daily internal debate about whether to do what you already decided to do. You are no longer checking your emotional state before determining whether to proceed. You simply execute what was already chosen. That simplicity creates clarity. It reduces the internal friction that exhausts people who rely on motivation and daily decision-making to sustain their behavior. Motivation promises ease, but consistently delivers instability. Discipline promises honest effort, but reliably delivers sustained control. There is a deeper transformation that occurs when discipline becomes genuinely integrated into your identity, rather than remaining something you occasionally practice. You stop perceiving yourself as someone who performs well when motivation is present. You begin recognizing yourself as someone who follows through, someone for whom completion is the expected outcome rather than a pleasant surprise. Identity shapes behavior more powerfully and more consistently than any emotional state ever could. When you identify as someone who is disciplined, action becomes expected rather than exceptional. This does not mean discipline eliminates the experience of struggle. It means struggle no longer holds authority over outcome. Resistance still arises. Fatigue still appears. But these experiences no longer control timing or commitment. They exist alongside action rather than blocking it. Discipline also fundamentally reshapes how the mind interprets the experience of discomfort. Initially, discomfort reads as threat, as a signal that something is wrong and that the activity producing the discomfort should be stopped. As discipline becomes more established, the mind begins to interpret discomfort differently. Effort stops feeling like evidence of unworthiness or misalignment. Resistance stops carrying meaning about whether the goal matters. These experiences become background texture, present but not commanding, rather than directives that stop action in its tracks. When motivation leads your life, emotions make the decisions. When discipline leads your life, you make the decisions. The mind ultimately obeys what is consistently enforced, not what feels intensely meaningful in an isolated moment. As you move forward from this section of the audiobook, commit to one practical shift. Stop waiting for the emotional state that feels right before acting. Decide once with clarity about what matters. Then follow that decision regardless of how you feel when the moment arrives. When your mind repeatedly observes that you no longer negotiate with emotional resistance, that you have stopped offering exceptions and special circumstances, it adapts. And when the mind fully adapts to this reality, obedience stops being something you force. It becomes something that simply reflects how your internal system operates. Consider the cumulative weight of the choices you have made in the last 30 days. Not the dramatic ones, the ordinary ones. The moment you decided whether to start the task you had been postponing. The moment you chose whether to respond to a difficult conversation with composure or reactivity. The moment you determined whether to follow through on a commitment when no external accountability existed to enforce it. Each of these moments was decided by something, either by a disciplined internal standard operating regardless of emotional conditions, or by whatever emotional state happened to be present in that moment. When you audit your behavior honestly against these two options, you begin to understand very precisely where your current results are coming from. And more importantly, you begin to see with absolute clarity what needs to change. The invitation here is not to judge what you find. The invitation is to use what you find as information. Information about where the gap currently lives between your intentions and your actions, and where the specific practice of discipline needs to be deepened. That gap is not a moral failing. It is a training deficit, and training deficits can be addressed with the same precision that you would bring to developing any other capacity, consistently, deliberately, without the expectation of perfection, but with the firm expectation of continued progress. Discipline does not remove emotion from your experience. It assigns emotion its accurate position in your hierarchy of decision-making. You continue to feel everything. You experience the highs and the lows with full presence. But your actions are no longer governed by the current state of your emotional weather. They are governed by what you decided, in clarity, actually matters. That is why discipline, not motivation, not inspiration, not the right emotional conditions, creates the lasting control that allows real growth to compound without limit. What you repeat, you command. What you enforce consistently, you own. This is not a slogan. It is a description of how behavioral authority actually forms in the human mind. And discipline, practiced faithfully across ordinary days, is how you repeat the right things often enough to own them completely. Your mind avoids difficulty for a reason that is both simple and deeply embedded. It was engineered to preserve comfort, conserve available energy, and minimize exposure to perceived risk. For hundreds of thousands of years, this engineering kept human beings alive and reproductive in genuinely dangerous environments. But in the modern landscape of your life, where the most important challenges are not physical threats, but psychological demands, demanding conversations, sustained effort toward meaningful goals, and the daily discipline of following through on commitments, this same engineering works quietly and persistently against you. When effort produces discomfort, the mind interprets that discomfort as a condition to escape. When something feels difficult, unfamiliar, or demanding, the mind searches automatically for a path toward relief. This is not a character deficiency. It is conditioning. Ancient, deeply practiced conditioning that runs below the level of conscious awareness. The problem does not begin with the conditioning itself. The problem begins when that conditioning goes entirely unchallenged across years and decades of repeated avoidance. Every single time you withdraw from what is difficult, your mind absorbs a lesson. It learns that discomfort signals genuine danger. It learns that delay is protective. It learns that escape is a viable and successful strategy. These lessons are not consciously taught. They accumulate through repetition, through each instance of avoidance being followed by the relief the mind was seeking. Over time, avoidance becomes so automatic you stop noticing it operating. You attribute it to external factors, low energy, poor timing, inadequate motivation, when what is actually happening is an untrained response pattern executing exactly as it was conditioned to execute. Training your mind to engage with difficulty is not about self-punishment or forced endurance for its own sake. It is about systematically teaching your mind a new and more accurate relationship with discomfort. Hard does not mean harmful. Hard does not mean impossible. Hard simply means that effort is required to proceed, and effort, when engaged deliberately, builds something that ease never can. When your mind learns through repeated experience that effort does not lead to damage, that discomfort does not signal danger, its resistance to difficult things begins to soften. The threshold at which it triggers avoidance gradually rises. What was once experienced as overwhelming becomes manageable. What once triggered immediate retreat becomes something you can approach, engage with, and move through. Most people fundamentally misunderstand the nature of strength. They believe strength is something that must be felt first, as an internal state of readiness, before action from that state becomes possible. This belief keeps the mind in permanent control. If you must feel capable before you act, then the mind, which determines what you feel, retains complete authority over when action occurs. In reality, strength is built through acting before it is present. You feel resistance. You act anyway. That act, repeated across sufficient instances, is what creates the capacity that felt unavailable before the first attempt. Waiting to feel strong keeps the mind in the dominant position. Acting while resistance is fully present teaches the mind a different and more accurate truth about its own authority. This is the central principle governing the training of a mind that will consistently engage with difficult things. The action precedes the readiness. The confidence emerges from the completion, not from the emotional state preceding it. Growth requires exposure, not overwhelming, indiscriminate exposure that produces trauma or exhaustion. Consistent, deliberately chosen exposure, the kind where you select the challenge rather than having it imposed on you. This distinction matters enormously. Difficulty that is imposed creates resentment and defensive resistance. Difficulty that is chosen creates authority and deliberate capability. When you select the hard thing, when you move toward it by choice, rather than being cornered by circumstance, you are not simply completing a task. You are reinforcing a hierarchy. You are demonstrating to your mind through your own behavior that you are the one who determines direction, not the discomfort, not the resistance, and not the feeling in the moment. Difficult things come in quiet, unglamorous forms. Staying focused when distraction is readily available and highly attractive. Maintaining effort when progress feels imperceptibly slow. Speaking with honesty when comfortable silence would protect you from friction. Starting the task you have been postponing when beginning feels disproportionately effortful. These moments do not appear significant. They carry no drama. They are not the stuff of visible achievement or external recognition, but they are precisely where training happens in its most formative dimension. Each one is an opportunity to reinforce a new rule in the operating system of your mind. Discomfort does not halt action. At first, resistance sounds loud and convincing. The mind complains with creative persistence. It negotiates with what sounds like reasonable logic. It generates excuses that feel justified and even compassionate toward yourself. Not today. You need adequate rest. You can address this tomorrow with better energy. This particular situation calls for a different approach. These internal arguments are not random. They are the mind's systematic attempt to reclaim behavioral authority. The mind is testing whether emotional discomfort retains the power to override your decisions about what happens next. Most people interpret this internal resistance as a legitimate signal to stop, as evidence that the timing is wrong, that the goal is misaligned, or that their body is communicating a genuine need. Training requires a different interpretation. Resistance is not a warning requiring compliance. It is feedback, specifically feedback indicating that the old pattern is being actively challenged and that the mind has not yet fully adapted to the new standard of behavior you are establishing. If you continue moving despite that resistance, something important occurs beneath the conscious level. The mind begins learning that its protests no longer reliably change outcomes. That the old strategy of escalating discomfort to produce behavioral retreat has stopped working as consistently as it once did. This learning does not happen after a single instance. It requires sustained repetition. But with each instance of continuation despite resistance, the mind's confidence in emotional escalation as a control mechanism weakens incrementally. Action is what trains the mind, not intention, not planning, not thinking carefully about what you should do differently. Acting while resistance is present. This is a critical distinction that separates people who talk about mental training from people who actually build it. You do not train your mind by thinking about doing difficult things while feeling comfortable. You train it by doing difficult things while fully experiencing the discomfort their difficulty produces. Waiting for resistance to resolve before acting is the precise mistake that keeps avoidance patterns permanently in place. Resistance consistently fades after action, rarely before it. Small acts carry disproportionate training value. Waking at the time you committed to when the body is urging additional rest. Completing a task without allowing yourself the distraction of checking your phone mid-process. Sustaining focused attention slightly longer than feels comfortable before releasing it. These micro choices accumulate with a power that exceeds their individual insignificance. They quietly reconstruct the internal hierarchy of your mind, establishing a new and more accurate order in which effort is expected rather than exceptional, discomfort is temporary rather than threatening, and avoidance is recognized as optional rather than necessary. Over time, your tolerance for difficulty expands measurably. What felt overwhelming at the beginning of this practice begins to feel manageable. What once required significant effort to begin begins to require only ordinary effort. This does not indicate that life is becoming easier. It indicates that you are becoming progressively more capable of engaging with what life actually requires. Your threshold rises. Stress that previously derailed your behavior becomes something you can carry and navigate without losing your functional capacity. There will be days when comfort prevails, days when the avoidance pattern wins the internal contest, days when you retreat from what you had committed to engaging with. These days are not evidence that training has failed. They are part of the landscape of any long-term practice. What matters is not whether avoidance occurs. What matters is the speed and quality of the return. Returning to your committed behavior without the additional weight of shame or self-criticism is itself a trained capacity. Shame weakens the internal authority you are working to build. Clarity restores it efficiently. Each time you notice avoidance operating and make a different choice on the next available opportunity, you reinforce control. You demonstrate that deviation does not become new standard. One principle defines the essence of this entire section. You do not need to feel ready to act. Acting is what produces readiness. You do not need to feel confident to engage with hard things. Engaging with hard things is what builds confidence that is durable under pressure. The order of these experiences matters profoundly. Most people wait for the internal state before initiating the action. The trained mind initiates the action and allows the internal state to form in response. The phrase that captures this most precisely: do it anyway. Not recklessly, not without awareness of what you are doing and why, but deliberately, feeling the full weight of the resistance and proceeding regardless, because you determined that it matters. This is how identity transforms at a fundamental level. You stop experiencing yourself as someone whose behavior is governed by the current state of emotional comfort. You begin experiencing yourself as someone who moves through discomfort with direction and intention. Over sustained practice, your relationship with discomfort itself transforms. It begins to feel less like a threat to be avoided and more like a consistent signal that something worthwhile is being built. The mind adapts to this expectation. It stops treating every instance of challenge as an emergency. It becomes quieter in the presence of difficulty, more settled, more willing to engage, more aligned with the person you are deliberately becoming. In the quantum field of conscious awareness, 520 carries a specific resonance, representing transformation, the active bridge between what has been and what is being built. Every time you choose the difficult thing over the comfortable alternative, you are crossing that bridge. You are in the act of becoming the person your future decisions will be made by. If this section is landing with real force, If you can feel the permission it creates to stop waiting for readiness and simply begin, drop 520 in the comments. Let it mark the moment you chose transformation over comfort. Reclaiming direction is what this practice is ultimately about. You are not just completing difficult tasks. You are shaping the mind that will face every future task. You are training it to understand. Through direct experience, rather than intellectual persuasion, that discomfort does not determine outcomes. Train with patience and consistency. Choose difficulty in small, repeatable increments. Over time, obedience to your direction becomes natural, not because you forced it through effort alone, but because you earned it through sustained action. Now, consider the relationship you have with your own thinking. Most people believe they are controlled by their thoughts in the same direct way they might be controlled by physical circumstances, as if a thought appearing is equivalent to an event occurring that must be responded to. A thought surfaces, and it is immediately treated as accurate. If the thought is pessimistic, discouragement follows automatically. If the thought is fearful, retreat begins without examination. If the thought is self-critical, doubt takes hold and narrows the available sense of possibility. This process happens so automatically, so seamlessly, that it feels impossible to locate any separation between the person and the content of what they are thinking. But that apparent impossibility is one of the most consequential illusions the untrained mind produces. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. This distinction is not philosophical abstraction. It is a practical and trainable shift in perspective that changes the entire quality of your internal experience. Thoughts are mental events, products of memory, habit, emotional state, and conditioning. They arise continuously, automatically, and often repetitively. Many of them are recycled versions of fears and stories that have been running for years. Many are inaccurate. Some carry genuine utility. Many do not. Yet, the untrained mind treats all thoughts with approximately equal authority. It listens to every internal voice and responds to each as if it requires immediate engagement. This is genuinely exhausting, and it is entirely unnecessary. The approach most people instinctively take when confronted with difficult or painful thoughts is to attempt to fight them. They argue internally with the negative thought. They try to replace it with a more positive version. They exert deliberate effort to force different thinking into the space the unwanted thought is occupying. This approach rarely produces lasting results. Fighting a thought gives it amplified attention. The energy invested in resistance paradoxically strengthens the thought's presence in awareness. What you resist mentally, you tend to reinforce. Detachment operates through an entirely different mechanism. Detachment does not involve suppressing thoughts or performing indifference to their content. It means transforming your relationship with thoughts as they arise, not attempting to change the thoughts themselves, but changing the position from which you encounter them. Instead of existing inside the thought, fully identified with its content and implications, you step back to a position where you can observe the thought without being captured by it. You allow it to exist in your awareness without engaging with it, following it, or acting from it. This shift removes the thought's authority over your behavior without requiring the internal conflict that fighting it produces. The untrained mind hears a thought and reacts from within it. I cannot handle this level of pressure. This will not work regardless of how much effort I invest. I am not equipped for what this requires. The trained mind notices the thought and labels it from a slight observational distance. Doubt is present. Fear is speaking. This is a familiar pattern that has appeared before. That small linguistic and cognitive shift creates distance between you and the content of the thought. And distance creates choice. Thoughts feel powerful in large part because they are relentlessly consistent. The mind generates thousands of them each day. Many are recycled. They revisit old fears, replay old stories, reinforce old assumptions that were never rigorously examined. This repetition creates a false sense of validity. Over time, you stop asking whether the recurring thought is accurate. Its persistence feels like evidence of its truth. But frequency is not accuracy. A thought that has appeared 10,000 times is not more true than a thought that appears for the first time. Training your mind means learning to allow thoughts to exist in awareness without automatically granting them authority over your behavior. This requires patience rather than force. The objective is not to eliminate thinking. Thinking is the essential instrument of a functioning mind. The objective is to stop treating every thought as a directive. One of the most effective practices in mental training is simple observation without judgment or engagement. When a thought arises, you acknowledge its presence. You do not argue with it. You do not follow it into its implications. You simply notice it and name it without evaluation. There is a thought about failure. There is a thought about giving up. There is a thought about inadequacy. Naming the thought reinforces the recognition that it is something you are experiencing, not something you are. The thought exists. You exist separately from it, as the one who notices its existence. At first, this practice produces discomfort. The mind wants engagement. It wants resolution. It wants the certainty that comes from either accepting or defeating the thought. When you refuse to provide that engagement, the mind typically escalates. Thoughts become more insistent, more dramatic in their claims, more urgent in their apparent demand for response. This escalation is not evidence that detachment is failing. It is evidence that the mind is testing whether its familiar strategy of intensification still produces the behavioral engagement it seeks. If you maintain the observational stance, if you continue noticing without reacting, something shifts. The thought loses momentum. Without the energy that active engagement would provide, it diminishes. Not immediately and not permanently on the first attempt, but consistently across repeated practice. Thoughts that are not fed through reaction lose their grip with increasing reliability. Detachment also provides meaningful protection against the emotional spirals that drain so much of people's mental and emotional resources. Thoughts trigger emotional responses. Emotional responses generate additional thoughts that are colored by the emotional state. Those thoughts intensify the emotional response further. The cycle feeds itself with increasing momentum. Detachment interrupts this cycle at its source. When you observe the initiating thought without reactive engagement, the emotional charge it would have generated is substantially reduced. The spiral does not build to the same height. The internal environment remains quieter and more navigable. There is an important shift in self-perception that emerges from sustained detachment practice. You gradually stop identifying with every thought that arises as a reflection of some fundamental truth about who you are. Instead of experiencing anxious thoughts as evidence that you are an anxious person, you begin recognizing anxious thoughts as mental events that occur within your awareness. Instead of experiencing self-critical thoughts as accurate assessments of your capabilities and worth, you begin recognizing them as patterns of thinking that have been conditioned into your mind over time. Patterns that can be observed without being accepted as authoritative. Detachment does not produce passivity in your engagement with life. It produces precision. You become more discerning about which thoughts deserve engagement, which deserve action, and which deserve simply to be noticed and allowed to pass. Useful thoughts receive appropriate attention. Repetitive, inaccurate, or unhelpful thoughts are allowed to exist without being granted authority over your decisions. This selectivity in mental engagement is one of the clearest expressions of trained leadership that exists. Detachment is a capacity built over time through patient, consistent practice. The mind will drift back into full identification with thought content. It will happen regularly. This is not a sign of inadequacy or insufficient effort. It is the predictable texture of the practice itself. Training is not the achievement of permanent detachment. Training is the gradual reduction of the time you spend fully identified with thought content before you notice and return to the position of observer. Over time, something genuinely significant changes. Thoughts still arise in the same volume and variety they always have, but they carry a different weight. They no longer dictate the quality of your internal state with the same automatic authority. They no longer make decisions about your behavior without your participation. You begin to experience the space between thought and response as a real and navigable territory, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived dimension of your daily experience. That space is where this section's central invitation lives. You are the observer. You are not the thought. You are not the emotion. You are the one who notices both, and who, through the patient practice of trained detachment, increasingly chooses where to direct the mind's extraordinary capacity. Reclaim your position as the one who watches. From that position, genuine clarity becomes consistently available. And from clarity, every decision you make becomes more aligned with who you are actually choosing to become. Calm is consistently misunderstood. Most people carry a hidden assumption that calm is a temperamental characteristic, something distributed unequally at birth, like height or natural talent in a specific domain. They observe people who remain steady under pressure and conclude that those individuals simply feel less or are constitutionally less reactive, or have been fortunate enough to encounter fewer, genuinely difficult circumstances. This assumption is not only inaccurate, it is actively harmful because it removes the possibility of development from the equation entirely. Calm is not a trait. Calm is a trained response, a capacity built through deliberate practice in the same way that any complex skill is built. When emotions move toward taking over, The body responds first and most immediately. Heart rate accelerates. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Muscles throughout the body tighten and prepare. Attention narrows sharply to the perceived source of the emotional activation. The entire system prepares for action, for fight, flight, or some variation of defensive behavior. This preparation is automatic. It does not wait for your permission or your conscious decision. What is not automatic, what is entirely within the domain of training, is what happens in the next moment. Calm is built in that next moment through the choices you make about how to respond to the activation that has already occurred. Most people confuse calm with suppression. They attempt to push emotions downward, to manage their external presentation while the internal pressure continues to build. This strategy creates a particular kind of internal damage. Suppressed emotion does not resolve. It accumulates. It waits. And when the pressure finally exceeds the capacity of suppression, it releases, often at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible form, directed at the worst possible target. The calm you are building through this training is not suppression. It is regulation, the trained ability to remain functional and deliberate while emotion is fully present and fully felt. The trained mind understands this distinction with clarity. When pressure arrives, the untrained mind interprets the emotional intensity as evidence of genuine emergency. It rushes to reduce the discomfort as quickly as possible. That rush produces impulsive speech, defensive posturing, reactive behavior that almost always creates more damage than the original situation warranted. Calm becomes inaccessible because the mind has decided that urgency demands immediate action rather than deliberate response. Training installs a different operating rule. Intensity does not equal emergency. This rule does not develop from simply being told it. It develops from repeatedly practicing a different response when intensity is present, from accumulating enough instances of remaining functional under activation that the mind begins to trust the new approach. The first skill in building sustained calm under pressure is learning to recognize activation early, before it has built to a level where the impulse toward reaction feels irresistible. Most significant emotional reactions do not emerge suddenly from a state of complete calm. They build from earlier, subtler signals that went unnoticed or unaddressed. The slight tightening across the chest that appears before you consciously register that something feels threatening. The minimal change in breath quality that precedes the full emotional surge. The early narrowing of attention that signals the system beginning to mobilize. When you develop sensitivity to these early signals, you gain access to a window of choice before the momentum toward reaction has fully built. You are intervening at the point where intervention is most effective. Breath, in this context, is not a relaxation technique. It is a physiological lever. Slow, deliberate. Exhales communicate directly to the nervous system that immediate action is not required, that the perceived emergency does not warrant the full activation response currently being prepared. This does not eliminate the emotion. It does not resolve the challenging situation. What it does is reduce the physiological intensity enough for awareness to remain operational rather than being overwhelmed by the activation. And awareness, the capacity to observe what is happening with some degree of perspective, is the essential foundation of calm under genuine pressure. Posture carries more influence over emotional state than most people realize or utilize. When emotions escalate, the body tends to reflect that escalation physically. Shoulders curl inward or rise defensively. The jaw tightens. The spine compresses slightly. Breathing becomes even more constricted than the emotional activation alone would produce. Each of these physical adjustments sends additional signals back to the nervous system that confirm the emergency interpretation. Deliberately adjusting posture, establishing an upright spine, releasing deliberate relaxation through the shoulders, unclenching the jaw, sends a different and more useful signal. The body and the mind communicate bidirectionally. Working with the body is not separate from working with the mind. It is the same work, approached through the more immediately accessible dimension. The internal language you use when emotions surge matters enormously and is almost completely under your control. The narratives the mind constructs during emotional activation tend toward drama and catastrophizing. This is unbearable. I cannot navigate this. Something has gone permanently wrong here. These narratives amplify the intensity of the emotional experience and further narrow the sense of available options. Training replaces these dramatic narratives with neutral observation. Significant emotion is present. Pressure is rising at this moment. I am noticing activation in my system. Neutral language does not diminish the feeling. It reduces the threat perception layered on top of the feeling. And reduced threat perception is what allows the nervous system to begin moving back toward a state where deliberate response is possible. Calm also requires extending genuine permission to yourself to not respond immediately. Many people believe that maintaining calm means resolving whatever is creating the pressure as rapidly as possible. The opposite is more often true. Staying calm frequently means deliberately delaying response, sitting in the discomfort of silence, of stillness, of waiting, rather than acting to eliminate the discomfort as quickly as the impulse to act demands. This delay is genuinely uncomfortable, particularly when emotions are pushing urgently toward expression or resolution. But delay is precisely what prevents the escalation cycle. Emotions that are not fed through reactive action peak and subside more quickly. They follow their natural arc rather than being amplified by behavioral responses that generate additional emotional activation in a self-reinforcing loop. Delaying response is not avoidance of the underlying issue. It is the selection of a more favorable moment for addressing it, a moment when you are operating from deliberate choice rather than from the compressed decision-making space that emotional urgency produces. Pressure is where training reveals itself. Almost anyone can appear and feel calm when circumstances are genuinely easy and comfortable. Calm in the presence of real pressure, the kind that would justify a reactive response, the kind that tests the entire internal structure you have been building, is where the difference between untrained and trained minds becomes impossible to ignore. You will not maintain calm perfectly across every situation. There will be moments when the emotional intensity exceeds your current capacity and the reaction emerges before the trained response can intercept it. This is the expected reality of any developmental process. Training is not the achievement of flawlessness. Training is the progressive improvement of recovery, becoming faster at recognizing that you have reacted, returning to a regulated state, and reestablishing deliberate behavior rather than continuing along the reactive trajectory. One of the most powerful shifts that comes with deepening calm practice is a reduction in attachment to controlling outcomes. A significant portion of the emotional intensity that people experience under pressure originates not from the circumstances themselves, but from the desperate need to control how those circumstances resolve. Calm becomes more consistently available when focus shifts from controlling outcomes, which is rarely fully possible, to directing conduct, which is always available, regardless of circumstances. You cannot guarantee how any situation will resolve. You can determine in every moment how you will respond to what is occurring. That distinction, lived rather than merely understood, is transformative. Staying calm also fundamentally protects the quality of your relationships over time. Emotional reactions damage trust more rapidly than almost any other category of behavior. Words delivered in intensity cannot be genuinely recalled once they have been heard. Decisions made under emotional pressure carry their consequences regardless of the emotional state that produced them. Calm preserves the clarity that allows communication to accomplish its actual purpose, rather than creating the additional relational damage that reactive behavior almost inevitably produces. Over sustained time and practice, people who interact with you regularly begin to sense a quality of safety in your presence. That sense of safety is one of the most powerful forms of influence available. It creates the conditions for the kind of honest, meaningful engagement that reactive environments make impossible. This is steadiness, not the absence of emotional experience, but the capacity to remain grounded while emotions move through you without surrendering behavioral control to their current intensity. Daily control is not something you establish once and then maintain indefinitely without continued attention. It is something you practice consistently or quietly lose. This is the point at which most people, even those who have genuinely developed meaningful self-command, eventually falter. They understand the principles. They have experienced moments of real control. But then the demands of daily life increase. Pressure accumulates. Old habits operate in the spaces where attention lapses, and gradually, without any single dramatic failure, the mind returns to its previously dominant patterns. The work of this final section is preventing that return, not through rigid willpower, not through the exhausting effort of constant vigilance, but through the construction of a daily structure that reinforces leadership automatically. Your mind does not obey intentions, it obeys patterns. What you repeat becomes the behavioral authority that operates when conscious attention is occupied elsewhere. What you practice consistently enough becomes genuinely automatic. If you want your mind to obey your direction reliably, not occasionally, not when conditions are ideal, but as its default operational mode, you must build a structure that reinforces that direction every day, particularly on the days when motivation is minimal and attention is stretched. The most common mistake in sustaining self-command is relying on willpower as the primary mechanism. Willpower is a finite resource that fluctuates directly with physical energy, emotional state, and accumulated stress. When willpower is depleted, which happens more quickly than most people anticipate under sustained pressure. Habits take over automatically. This is precisely why systems carry more long-term authority than individual acts of effort. Systems operate when effort is unavailable. Making your mind consistently obey your direction means removing behavioral decisions from the moments when your capacity for deliberate choice is most compromised. You decide in advance, from a position of clarity and adequate resources, how you will act in the categories of situation that matter most. Then you follow that pre-committed decision regardless of what your emotional state indicates when the moment arrives. Begin with non-negotiables, not an extensive and overwhelming list. A small number of specific behaviors you perform every day without internal debate or negotiation. They do not need to be dramatic in scope. They need to be consistent in practice. A consistent time at which you begin your focused work, a daily practice of deliberately pausing before responding in situations that activate emotional reactivity. These behaviors function as anchors for the entire internal structure. When your mind knows that certain behaviors are genuinely non-negotiable, that they are not subject to the daily internal negotiation about whether today merits an exception, the resistance to those behaviors diminishes substantially. This is how behavioral obedience becomes genuinely natural, not through force, but through the established predictability of consistent follow-through. Identity is a more reliable guide to sustained behavior than any goal you have set. Goals are temporary. They have completion points, after which the behavioral commitment they generated typically dissolves. Identity is continuous. It describes not a destination, but a consistent orientation toward every moment. Instead of framing your behavioral commitments in terms of what you are trying to achieve, reinforce them in terms of who you are becoming through consistent practice. I am someone who pauses before responding when activation is present. I am someone who completes what I begin without renegotiating the commitment midway through. I am someone who engages deliberately with difficulty rather than organizing my behavior around the avoidance of discomfort. These statements are not affirmations in the sense of positive thinking tools. They are precise descriptions of standards you enforce through your behavior. Standards that become more accurately descriptive with each instance of follow-through. The number 888 carries specific significance in quantum field consciousness research, representing infinite flow, the abundance that emerges from sustained alignment, and the energy of what compounds without limit when it is built on a foundation of genuine internal order. Every day that you practice these principles, every pause you build, every moment of discipline you honor, every thought you observe without being governed by, is a contribution to that compounding. If this audiobook has shifted something real in how you understand and relate to your own mind, if these 8 principles have created movement in the direction of genuine self-command, drop 888 in the comments right now at Elite Success Audiobooks. Let it mark the moment you chose the path that compounds toward mastery. Over sustained time, something significant and qualitatively different begins to emerge. You stop actively forcing control in each individual moment. You stop negotiating continuously. Decisions arrive with greater clarity and less internal friction. Emotional reactions slow perceptibly before they reach behavioral expression. Calm surfaces more quickly after activation, with less distance traveled before recovery. This is not because life has simplified. Life tends to maintain its complexity regardless of your internal development. It is because your internal system has become stable, reliable, genuinely coherent. Throughout this audiobook, one truth has been returned to from every direction. Your emotions are not your adversary. Your thoughts are not the obstacle. The challenge and the opportunity lives in what happens when either is allowed to lead without deliberate oversight. When emotions determine timing, when thoughts dictate direction, when reactions replace the conscious choice that is always available, but that requires training to access reliably. You have now encountered the full framework of that training. You learned that your mind was never taught to lead, only to react with impressive speed and consistency. You learned that emotions are signals with genuine informational value, not commands with mandatory behavioral authority. You learned how to construct the pause, that essential interval between feeling and action, where genuine choice becomes available. You learned why discipline is the only reliable mechanism for sustained behavioral change. You learned that doing difficult things is the precise mechanism through which capability, confidence, and genuine authority are constructed. You learned to detach from thoughts without fighting them. You learned that calm is a trainable skill built through awareness, breath, physical grounding, precise language, and the deliberate practice of delayed response. And you learned that the control you have been building must be reinforced daily through the intelligent structure of systems, identity, and consistent follow-through. None of this requires perfection. What matters is the practice, the small, consistent, unglamorous practice of choosing differently in the ordinary moments that constitute the actual fabric of your life. Each pause you build, each moment you feel full discomfort and stay present with it rather than retreating. Each time you act without waiting for the emotional conditions to align in your favor. These moments appear unremarkable from the outside, but they compound internally with extraordinary power. At a certain point in this process, and if you practice with genuine consistency, you will experience it firsthand. Something shifts. You stop being surprised by the quality of your own responses under pressure. You stop breaking the commitments you make to yourself and wondering why. You stop experiencing yourself as subject to your moods rather than as their author. Your responses carry a different quality of deliberateness. Your decisions arrive with a clarity that was not consistently available before. You begin to trust yourself, not because you feel perpetually confident, but because you have accumulated sufficient evidence through your own behavior that you follow through even when following through is genuinely difficult. That trust is the actual foundation of confidence that is durable under pressure. Life will continue presenting its full range of challenges. Stress will surface. Emotions will surge. Thoughts will argue their familiar cases. None of that disappears with training. What changes is your position relative to all of it. You are no longer operating from inside the pressure. You are directing your response to it, feeling the full experience, remaining present with its genuine difficulty, and choosing deliberately how to act within it. This is not dominance over your human experience. This is the leadership of it. If the principles in this audiobook have created genuine movement in how you understand and relate to your own mind, share it with someone in your life who would benefit from this framework, someone who recognizes themselves as living at the mercy of their emotional reactions, someone who senses correctly that they are capable of far more than their current patterns are allowing them to access. Sometimes, the most valuable thing you can offer another person is a clear and practical map of how to begin leading their own inner world. Return to your daily life carrying this understanding forward. The training continues in every ordinary moment, in conversations that test your patience, in commitments that test your follow-through, in the quiet moments when nothing external is forcing the choice and it is entirely up to you what you do next. Those moments are where the real work lives. Those moments are where everything this audiobook has offered is either practiced into permanence or allowed to fade back into the familiar. Choose the practice. Build the pattern. Trust the repetition. Your mind is already more capable of genuine self-command than you may yet fully recognize. This audiobook from Elite Success Audiobooks has given you the map. The territory is your daily life, and you, with the training you have now begun, are entirely equipped to navigate it with the kind of deliberate, grounded, consistent leadership that most people never discover is available to them. What you repeat, you command. What you enforce, consistently, you own. Build the patterns, and the authority follows naturally. Train daily, lead consistently. Let obedience emerge from structure, not from struggle. There is a moment in every serious training process that nobody warns you about. It does not arrive with drama. It does not announce itself with a significant event or a recognizable turning point. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, in the middle of an ordinary day. You are in a conversation that would have triggered you 3 months ago. The same words, the same pressure, the same invitation to react. And you notice, not after the fact, not with regret, but in the moment itself, you notice the activation rising. You feel the familiar pull toward the old response. And without effort, without forcing, without the intense internal negotiation that used to consume you, you simply choose differently. Not because you are suppressing anything, not because you are performing composure for an audience, because something in the structure of how your mind operates has genuinely shifted. That moment is not the destination of mental training. It is the confirmation that training has been compounding all along. Most people who begin the work described in this audiobook expect the change to feel dramatic. They expect a clear before and after, a version of themselves that struggles to control reactions, and then a version that does not. What actually happens is quieter and more interesting than that. Change accumulates beneath the surface. Each pause practiced, each moment of discipline honored, each thought observed without automatic obedience. These do not produce visible transformation in the day they occur. They build something, and what they build is only fully visible in hindsight. When you look back at who you were 6 months ago and realize you are operating from an entirely different internal architecture. This is the compound effect of mental training. And understanding how it works is what separates people who practice these principles temporarily from people who practice them for life. Compounding requires consistency more than intensity. This is the principle that most people intellectually agree with and practically ignore. They push hard for a period, experience the enthusiasm of early effort, and then encounter the plateau, the stretch of time when nothing feels like it is changing, when the training feels mechanical and unrewarding, when the internal voice starts asking whether any of this is actually working. This plateau is not a warning, it is a phase. It is the phase where the deepest structural change is occurring, below the level that conscious experience can easily detect. The neural pathways that govern automatic behavior change slowly. They require sustained repetition across extended time before the new pattern begins to feel genuinely effortless. The plateau is where most people stop, and it is precisely where the people who develop lasting self-command decide to continue. What sustains you through the plateau is not motivation. You already understand why motivation is insufficient for this. What sustains you is the identity you have been building through consistent action. When you have accumulated enough instances of pausing, enough instances of choosing discipline over emotional comfort, enough instances of observing a thought without obeying it, a new self-perception begins to settle in, not as an affirmation you repeat, as an accurate description of how you actually behave. This shift in identity is the most durable fuel available for long-term mental training. Goals motivate temporarily. Identity sustains permanently. There is another dimension of compounding that extends beyond your internal experience. As your self-command deepens, it begins to change the quality of every environment you inhabit. The people around you respond differently to someone who is genuinely regulated. Not because you have explained your training to them, not because you have announced any commitment, but because the quality of presence that comes from trained, calm, and deliberate response is something others feel without being able to name. Conversations with you feel safer. Decisions made alongside you feel clearer. Conflict involving you tends to resolve rather than escalate. This is influence, not manufactured, not performed, but the natural consequence of operating from genuine inner authority. And it compounds in exactly the same way your internal training compounds. Each interaction where your self-command holds under genuine pressure adds to the evidence others build about who you are and what they can expect from you. Trust accumulates. Respect deepens. The quality of what you are able to build with others, in relationships, in professional contexts, in communities, expands in proportion to the reliability of your internal regulation. This is what it actually means to develop your inner game. The inner game does not stay inside. It expresses outward into every area of your life with increasing force and increasing subtlety the longer you practice it. Now, consider what the trained life actually feels like from the inside, not as an ideal to aspire to, but as a practical, daily reality available to you through sustained practice. It does not feel like constant, effortful control. That is the misconception that keeps people from understanding what they are working toward. It feels like a quieter mind, a mind that does not sound alarms for every uncomfortable sensation, a mind that does not generate urgent narratives about every challenge encountered, a mind that has learned through sufficient repetition that most of what it once treated as emergencies are simply experiences that do not require immediate reactive response. The volume of internal noise lowers over time. This is not because difficult things stop happening. They continue to happen with approximately the same frequency and intensity that they always have. It is because the mind has stopped amplifying them through automatic reactive engagement. When the mind no longer treats every emotional signal as a command, when it no longer follows every thought into its full anxious implications, a quality of inner spaciousness becomes available that most people have never experienced as an adult. There is room to think clearly, room to respond rather than react, room to feel fully without being overwhelmed by what is felt. That spaciousness is the practical reward of mental training, not the absence of challenge, the presence of space within challenge. One of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the trained life is its effect on your relationship with time. When you are operating from reaction, when emotions and automatic thoughts are driving your moment-to-moment experience, time feels compressed and urgent. There is never enough of it. Everything demands immediate attention. The future feels threatening, and the present feels insufficient. When you are operating from trained self-command, your experience of time changes. The pause you have built into your relationship with emotional activation literally creates more psychological time in each situation. You experience the same intervals as longer because you are actually present within them rather than being carried through them by reactivity. Decisions feel less rushed. Responses feel more considered. The quality of attention you bring to each moment improves because that attention is no longer being constantly fragmented by unmanaged internal noise. This change in the experience of time is one of the subtler and more profound gifts of sustained mental training. It is also one of the most practical. The ability to remain present, fully present, without being pulled backward into regret or forward into anxiety, is not a spiritual luxury. It is a functional advantage in every domain of life that matters to you. As this audiobook from Elite Success Audiobooks draws toward its close, there is one final principle to carry forward. The trained life is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain effortlessly forever. It is a practice you return to every day with the same deliberateness that built it in the first place. There will be periods when the practice deepens, periods when external pressure tests everything you have built and reveals both its strength and its remaining gaps. Periods when old patterns resurface under sufficient stress, reminding you that training is maintenance as much as it is development. None of these cycles are failures. They are the natural rhythm of any living practice. What defines the person who builds lasting self-command is not that they never lose ground. It is that they return to the practice without drama, without extended self-judgment, without the story that a temporary setback means the training was never real. They return because they have experienced what it feels like to operate from genuine inner authority. And that experience, once genuinely felt, becomes one of the most compelling reasons to continue that exists. The invitation this final section offers is simple. Take everything this audiobook has built and treat it not as a course you completed, but as a framework you inhabit. Return to the principles that resonated most powerfully. Practice the specific skills that revealed the largest gaps in your current self-command. Build the pause into your most triggered relationships. Apply discipline to your most avoided commitments. Detach from the thoughts that most consistently produce your least useful emotional states. Practice calm in the situations that most reliably compromise your steadiness. And do all of this not with the goal of becoming perfect, but with the goal of becoming reliably, recognizably, demonstrably more yourself. The version of you that does not need external circumstances to align before choosing deliberately. The version of you that can feel fully without surrendering to what is felt. The version of you that shows up not occasionally, not when conditions are favorable, but as the consistent expression of a mind that has been trained to serve your actual values rather than your momentary comfort. That version of you is not a distant aspiration. It is what these practices build, one ordinary moment at a time. What the earlier sections of this audiobook gave you were the individual tools. What this final section offers is the understanding of how those tools work together across time, not as separate techniques applied in separate situations, but as an integrated internal system that gradually becomes the default operating mode of your mind. Think of the pause not as an isolated skill, but as the gateway through which every other principle becomes accessible. Without the pause, discipline cannot engage before emotion has already driven behavior. Without the pause, detachment from thought cannot occur before the thought has already produced its reactive consequence. Without the pause, calm cannot be chosen before urgency has already dictated the response. The pause is the hinge on which the entire system turns. And the more consistently you build it, the more the other capacities it enables begin to strengthen in parallel. Discipline deepens because the pause creates the interval within which disciplined choice becomes possible. Detachment strengthens because the pause creates the observational distance from which thoughts can be witnessed rather than inhabited. Calm becomes more accessible because the pause interrupts the physiological momentum toward activation before it reaches its peak. Every principle reinforces every other principle when the pause is consistently in place. This integration is what the compound effect of mental training ultimately produces, not a collection of separate skills applied with effort to separate situations, a unified internal architecture that operates coherently across the full range of your daily experience. The person who has built this architecture does not need to remember to apply the tools in a moment of pressure. The tools have become the structure of how the mind operates. That is the difference between knowing about mental training and having genuinely built it. One is information held in memory. The other is capacity expressed in behavior. The only path from one to the other is through sustained practice in real situations with real emotional stakes, which means the most important thing this audiobook can leave you with is not another principle to understand. It is the commitment to return to practice, today, in whatever ordinary situation presents itself, and to keep returning across the days and weeks and months through which this training compounds into something genuinely and permanently yours. Begin again. Always begin again. That willingness to begin again without shame and without hesitation is itself the most advanced expression of the mental training you have been building throughout this entire audiobook. The training continues, and so do you.